The keel of USS Squalus, which is Latin for shark, was laid down at Portsmouth Navy Yard in 1937, and the boat was commissioned in March 1939. This Sargo-class submarine had a top speed of 20 knots when surfaced and 7.75 knots submerged. Sargo-class subs were outfitted with 8 torpedo tubes, 4 forward and 4 aft, along with a 3-inch deck gun. This class also carried a newly designed battery that contained 2 concentric rubber cases with a layer of softer rubber between, which was made to resist damage from depth charges. Squalus was the second for class to be built, commanded by Lieutenant Oliver Naquin, a 1925 graduate of the U.S. Naval Academy. On the morning of May 23, 1939, after having already successfully completed 18 test dives, Squalus was executing a practice crash dive along the coast between New Hampshire and Maine with 56 crewmen and 3 civilian contractors on board. 66 feet into the dive, a catastrophic failure of the main induction valve caused water to rush into the back half of the submarine. Naquin ordered the sub to surface, but the severe flooding pulled her down by the stern. As the engine room began filling with seawater, one brave sailor crawled between the arcing 6-foot-tall batteries, shutting them off before they could explode, but also plunging the crew into darkness. Naquin ordered a large steel door between the engine room and the operating compartment to be closed off, saving 33 of the original 59 crewmen on board. The boat sank silently before settling on the seabed, approximately 243 feet below the surface, in nearly freezing water. Thankfully, when command did not receive the expected surface report from Squalus, the communication officer was notified and attempts were made to contact the missing sub. When these attempts failed, her sister ship, USS Sculpin, was sent with directions to make every attempt to locate her and stay in the area until successful. Through the diligence of Sculpin's crew, a red smoke bomb was quickly sighted and communication made through the telephone buoy. As the situation was unfolding, it came to the attention of Lieutenant Commander Charles Mommsen, a 1919 graduate of the U.S. Naval Academy and former skipper of the U.S. submarine S-1, who was at the time leading the experimental diving unit at the Washington Navy Yard. An avid diver and inventor of the deep-sea rescue device commonly called the Mommsen lung, he and his diving crew were immediately flown from Washington, D.C. Mommsen reported that by midnight, 5 officers and 20 enlisted men had arrived at the scene of the accident. Aboard the sunken submarine, his Mommsen lung had already been distributed to all men by Captain Naquin. Mommsen was able to create a prototype of his rescue bell chamber, but before he could complete improvements, he was called to the Bureau of Construction and Repair to train on the proper use of his newly adopted submarine escape lung. At that point, Lieutenant Commander Alan Rockwell McCann, a 1917 graduate of the U.S. Naval Academy who had commanded several early U.S. submarines, took over the redesign of the bell chamber. When it was completed, it was released as the McCann Submarine Rescue Chamber. The chamber weighed in at 10 tons, was 10 feet tall and 7 foot 9 inches in diameter. It could carry 7 passengers with 2 operators, operated in water up to 850 feet deep, and was used all the way into the early 1990s. McCann was also involved in the rescue operation of the Squalus crew. He was aboard the submarine rescue ship USS Falcon, which arrived overnight on May 24th, carrying the new rescue chamber, which had only ever been used for training purposes. So with Mommsen overseeing the divers and McCann overseeing the use of the chamber, the rescue of the Squalus's crew commenced. In the morning, the very first diver, Martin C. Sibitsky, a second-class bosun's mate on the Falcon, who was over 6 feet tall and, according to Mommsen, about 200 pounds of the Navy's best brawn, utilized a dragline that had been used in attempts to locate the Squalus. The dragline amazingly brought him within 6 feet of the forward torpedo room hatch. He was also able to untangle a buoy line and attach the downhaul wire for the rescue chamber. In the rescue report, this diver was credited with marked expedition of the entire rescue operation. The rescue chamber was lowered into the water and began its first trip down at 11:30 a.m., about 26 hours after the sinking. At 12:47, they successfully opened the hatches and were greeted with no cheers, but a few wisecracks. Why the delay, and where the hell are the napkins, as they distributed warm soup, sandwiches, and other provisions to the waiting men. The air in the submarine was ventilated for several minutes as the first survivors climbed into the rescue chamber. This successful trip justified the vision, faith, and hard work of those involved in the development of the equipment, according to the commander of the rescue operations. According to Mommsen, it was a routine drill for us, but in the eyes of the outside world, a miracle. We tried to appear calm, and maybe others were, but to me, this was the most exciting moment of my life. 11 years of preparation, combating skepticism and constructing imaginary disasters, all telescoped into one moment. Who could remain calm? 25 men were successfully brought up this way in 3 trips, but during the 4th ascent, with the remaining survivors, including Captain Naquin aboard, the motor stalled, not quite halfway up, and attempts to continue the ascent using the brake proved too dangerous, with a strain on the retrieval wire. The chamber had to be lowered back down to the submarine. A diver was deployed to cut the downhaul line so the chamber could be pulled up using the retrieval wire winch. But then that wire frayed, with just one strand of the wire still attached, so we were forced again to lower the chamber to the bottom. 2 divers then attempted to attach a new retrieval wire to the chamber on 2 separate trips, but the darkness of night prevented their success. Instead, the chamber operators blew the ballast a little bit at a time to try to achieve neutral buoyancy, and the men on the deck of the Falcon began to pull the retrieval wire hand over hand. Shortly after midnight, after 4.5 hours in the rescue chamber and 40 hours after the sinking, all men were safely hauled aboard the Falcon. The next day, a final descent in the chamber proved that there were no remaining survivors. 26 men had perished. For their heroism at the risk of their own lives, 4 Navy divers, Chief Machinist Mate William Batters, Chief Boatswain's Mate Orson L. Crandall, Chief Metalsmith James Harper McDonald, and Torpedoman First Class John Milowski were awarded the Medal of Honor. The Navy began salvage operations under the direction of Mommsen, but the stern was sunk firmly into clay. It took 50 days to burrow under the wreckage and attach cables. On July 13th, when attempting to lift the submarine, the bow rose uncontrollably and shot out of the water for a few moments before she sank back to the bottom, breaking lines, pontoons, and according to Mommsen, also a few hearts. After a total of 113 days, the wreck was successfully lifted. She was towed into the Portsmouth Navy Yard, decommissioned, repaired, and overhauled. The boat was renamed USS Sailfish for the way she flew out of the water during salvage, and recommissioned on May 15th, 1940. In 1945, when the boat was decommissioned, there was an effort to have it preserved as a museum. The effort was unsuccessful, but the boat's sail was removed and preserved and is today on display at the Portsmouth Naval Shipyard in Kittery, Maine. The successful rescue of the Squalus survivors is a testament to the determination of fellow submariners as well as Navy divers. Monson and McCann's dedication to develop the equipment necessary to help preserve the lives of the men who risked their lives in the silent service facilitated an extraordinary rescue that deserves to be remembered.
Of a disaster under the sea.
A head-on collision at 40 miles per hour is by any standard a bad accident. But a head-on collision in a submarine 525 feet deep in the middle of the Pacific Ocean is a disaster. That's exactly what happened to the USS San Francisco when it struck an undersea mountain in one of the worst accidents in modern naval history. But first, you'll hear the crew of the San Francisco tell you how they survived 52 harrowing hours at sea. This is what a $1 billion fast-attack nuclear submarine looks like. This is what the San Francisco looked like after the accident. Its entire bow shattered.
We took a full frontal hit.
How close do you think you came to losing that sub?
I think we came pretty close.
Commander Kevin Mooney was the sub's captain on that day in January.
I do accept full responsibility for the grounding of San Francisco. I expected the Navy to hold me accountable for this horrible accident, and they did.
They were passing through the Caroline Islands at a depth of 525 feet when 7,000 tons of steel with 137 souls on board came to a crashing halt.
The noise was deafening, initially.
Deafening like a
explosion.
Mooney was eating lunch in the wardroom and was thrown across the table. What was your first thought?
My first thought was that I was going to die.
And all of a sudden, you find yourself slammed into something, and the whole world's shaking.
Senior Chief Danny Hager was in the sub's control room and smashed into the instrument panel.
And immediately, I knew that we'd hit something, and it was going to be bad.
I remember just bodies everywhere.
Petty Officer Brian Barnes was standing in the lunch line and was thrown to the deck.
Broken glass, stepping on plates, your shipmates moaning because they're in pain, yelling.
We had a lot of people thrown, you know, up 20, 25 feet. Those were the guys that were injured the worst because, you know, there's not very many soft things on a submarine.
Those still able began to take stock of the damage. Flooding is what every member of the crew dreaded most. At 525 feet deep, the water pressure is 16 times what it is at the surface. If there were any serious leaks in the inner hull, water would come rushing in and doom the ship within minutes.
The enemy is out there, and it's seawater, and it's trying to get in.
The crew of the San Francisco performed what's called an emergency blow, pumping air into the sub's ballast tanks to float it to the surface. All eyes turned to Hager, who was monitoring the depth gauge.
I told him 525 feet, 0 acceleration, and I'm waiting. You know, 5 seconds, 10 seconds, I don't know how long it was, you know, 525 feet, 0 acceleration. And it was just absolute silence and control because they were waiting for me to report that we were accelerating upwards.
And all you've got to say is 525.
525 feet, no acceleration.
What they didn't know at the time was most of their front ballast tanks were destroyed.
So the forward tanks were ruptured, and that air you were trying to pump into them was just going out into the ocean.
Just going out into the ocean.
Finally, air filled the rear tanks, which slowly began pulling the sub up.
You could feel the pregnant pause, and then almost the relief when I said 500 feet acceleration upwards.
How long did it take to get the sub to the surface?
It took a few minutes.
Must have been about the longest few minutes of everybody's life.
It certainly was.
Getting the San Francisco to the surface was just the beginning.
The crew had to get that ship home. An injured crew, a beaten crew.
A terrified crew.
Yes, I think the crew was terrified. There was blood all over the decks.
98 of the 137 crew members had been injured, about 20 of them seriously enough that they could no longer man their watch stations. Petty Officer Joey Ashley was the worst off with a massive head injury.
Basically, he'd flown about 20, 25 feet and struck a pump head first, and he was in serious critical condition.
Mooney radioed for help, but the San Francisco was hundreds of miles from home, and there were no ships nearby. Its bow was crushed, its propeller bobbing in and out of the water, and the crew wasn't sure they could keep it from going down. As the hours passed, the crew struggled to put the submarine back in some kind of working order, while at the same time caring for the injured, especially Petty Officer Ashley, who was given an emergency tracheotomy to keep him breathing.
Everyone kind of switched off with Ashley. They kind of stayed with him 24/7, around the clock, just holding his hand, taking care of him.
When word came that a rescue helicopter was finally en route, Ashley, who was strapped onto a stretcher in the bowels of the submarine, had to be moved through a labyrinth of tight passageways and up a narrow ladder to an exit hatch 25 feet above the main deck.
We were cutting off railings and just doing anything we possibly could to ease the passage of that stretcher from where he was down in the crew's mess up to the area right below the bridge hatch.
This is video of the helicopter hovering over the San Francisco.
The water was washing over the top of the submarine.
And with the wave movement and the submarine moving, it was really dangerous.
That's how we were unable to get him in his stretcher through the bridge hatch.
So when the stretcher comes up like that,
right,
it's hitting the hatch and you can't get it past the hatch.
Couldn't squeeze it through.
Ashley clung to life for more than 24 hours, but the failed attempt to airlift him off the sub had literally been his last gasp.
When they brought him back down from that was when they lost him. It's pretty sad.
Yeah, real sad. One of your best sailors.
One of the best on board.
The crew had no choice but to press on in a sub once capable of doing 40 miles an hour underwater, limped home on the surface at only 10.
And how long did it take to get her back?
52 hours from when we grounded to when we moored in Guam.
So now the San Francisco sits in dry dock here on the island of Guam. You can't see the worst of the damage anymore because a steel shield has been placed over the bow to make it seaworthy enough to sail to the States for permanent repairs. It will probably cost $100 million and take 2 years to put the San Francisco back in service.
The standard that the submarine force holds me and every other person to are high because they have to be. We can't afford to have another San Francisco.